the way that I see the breath and the role of the breath, how it impacted me to begin with, and how it continues to impact me and the people that I work with, is through this lens of three core challenges of modern existence. The first being disconnection and disembodiment from self. This is just the exact issue that I was facing way back when. The second being chronic dysregulation, anxiety, stress, burnout on a mass scale. Society is dysregulated, so of course we are dysregulated at a large scale. And then the third being disconnection from meaning and purpose. So this absence of traditional meaning structures, this absence of religion, absence of spirituality, the rise of nihilism and fundamentalism. The people in the middle, the bulk of us, haven't got a huge amount to believe in and have faith in. And that makes for a very mind-led, intellectually led society that only breeds a level of discontent to an extent from that over-analytical place. And so 3 core issues. I'm not here to say ever that breath will solve all of your problems, but I do believe breath can play a role in addressing those 3.
Welcome to the Heart of Man podcast, a podcast for any man seeking to live in alignment with his deepest core and lead a life of profound meaning and connection. I'm your host, Alex Lehman, and I'm here to empower you through transformative conversations, eye-opening insights, and practical wisdom. Join me now as we venture into the heart of man. Let's dive in. Breathwork has been and continues to be a foundational part of my personal and professional journey. Yet after nearly 50 episodes, we've yet to dive deep into its transformative power. This is something I'm excited to change today in my conversation with Jamie Clements. As a leading breathwork coach and the founder of the Breath Space, Jamie is dedicated to helping people reconnect with themselves through the accessible and transformative tool of their own breath. Having struggled with anxiety, depression, and panic attacks in his late teens and early 20s, Jamie discovered the power of breathwork through his own lived experience. What began as a tool for exploration to support him on his journey ultimately became a pathway to embodiment, emotional freedom, and purpose. His mission today is to make breathwork both accessible and transformative, whether it's performance breathwork for athletes, therapeutic breathwork for healing, or simple breathing techniques for nervous system regulation. Jamie emphasizes that the power of the breath can support us all. He works with a wide range of clients, from entrepreneurs and athletes to creatives and professionals, supporting them in cultivating healthier and more resilient lives. In our conversation, Jamie and I explore his personal journey, from disconnection, disembodiment, and loss of purpose to reconnection, inner alignment, and meaning. This opened up a deeper exploration around the challenges of our time and how so many men are conditioned to live out the scripts of who we think we should be rather than embracing who we truly are. We distill this umbrella term of breathwork into 3 core pillars: functional breathing for everyday health, emotional regulation and nervous system balance, and therapeutic/transformational breathwork for healing. Throughout our conversation, we dive into the nuances of each pillar, highlighting key things to pay attention to, common pitfalls to avoid, and the personal breakthroughs and benefits that can emerge from this powerful practice. We also discuss the importance of discernment when pursuing this path and how meaningful inner work requires the support of community, integration, and embracing who we already are today. As I see it, this episode is a powerful one for any man looking to understand the depth and breadth of breathwork, not just as a tool, but as a way of living. It offers both practical insights alongside emotional depth for anyone on a path of healing, self-discovery, and embodied leadership. And now, let's drop into this rich and powerful dialogue with Jamie Clements. Jamie Clements, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here on the Heart of Man. I was excited to drop in with you before you leave the island of Bali.
It's great to be here, man. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I was just having a coffee this morning with a friend and saying, since I've been here, I've been working gently, intentionally slowing down, but it's nice actually to come back into more of what we'll call a work setting. But yeah, just nice to drop in and to be here and share this space.
I very much agree. And before we start rolling, I shared with you, I was very excited for this interview because after so many interviews that I've now published and also recorded, I haven't done one where I specifically dove into the breath and what many people will know and some people will not know is that I include a lot of somatic and breath work into the work that I do. And that's something I've done for the last 4 years, having trained as well under Edward Dangerfield with Breathwork Bali. And I've always seen myself as more of a generalist, but I think there is an incredible value for us diving deep into that conversation and considering as well that you focus so deeply in that topic. I think this would be a beautiful opportunity for us to come together. But before we dive into everything around breathwork, I want to give our listeners a bit of an opportunity to get to know you. And I would love for you to share with our listeners, what would they need to know about you that made breathwork so significant in your life? What is it about the practice that led you to devote, let's say, this chapter of your life to it? And what I'm as well particularly interested in is hearing your references around the things that you experienced were only symptoms to a bigger disconnection of self.
Absolutely. I suppose the version of these stories that we tell of ourselves can stretch back different lengths of time. And for me, I would say I was always a very sensitive, curious child. And that has stayed with me and continued for all of my life up until this point. It was something around sort of in my early teens where I feel like I developed this real passion for and interest in human nature through my own lens, I suppose. Why do I think the way that I think? Why do I feel the way that I feel? Why do I act the way that I act? And through that became interested in philosophy and psychology. And then for reasons that we'll explore and come to, reached a point where that seemed to dissipate and fade into the background. And around the age sort of 15, 16, my parents separated, which was a significant moment in my life. I suppose what we might label a form of trauma. And that led me into probably a broader chapter of, say, 15 to 25 years old, where I became increasingly disconnected from myself. I can see now, and there are still legacy parts of this in me, but I became fixated unconsciously on fitting in, on I wanted to be popular. I wanted to be quote unquote successful. I wanted to have the prettiest girlfriend and the biggest group of friends and all of these things that lots of us fall into. You know, we get told that is our route into happiness and fulfillment. And even when that promise doesn't get fulfilled, we still think that it'll happen. And right. I still think in certain forms that it'll happen. If I just do this, then I'll get there. And then
it's a very convincing story.
Oh, the world loves to promise us this fulfillment based on external forms. And even though we've been let down thousands of times by that promise, we still somewhere in there believe that we're the exception to the rule. And if we just get to that thing, then we'll be fine. And so I, in that period of sort of, 15 to 24, 25, really went down that road. I went to a good university, got a good degree, started moving towards working in the city in London, in finance, in very much what felt like the only path that I could ever see, because I actually didn't have a huge amount of exposure to anything beyond that. I was playing sport to a high level. I was, quote unquote, doing the things that I thought I needed to do in order to feel a certain way, and feeling so far from that way. And so through that period of my late teens and my early 20s, started having challenges with my mental health in the forms of anxiety, what I would probably in hindsight label as depression, but not clinical. And then late teens, early 20s, probably I think I was 21 when I had my first panic attack, and started having an increasing number of panic attacks. The anxiety worsened and reached a point where I struggled with suicidal ideation. I was lost, I think we can do the long version of the story, but I think the short version of the story was that I was deeply lost. And as you mentioned as well, this underlying root cause of just deeply being disconnected from myself and not knowing how to come back to myself. I think that promise that the world had told me and that I'd told myself, that if I just do these things and tick these boxes, then I'll be okay, was all I'd ever known. And so to be slapped in the face by the fact that that really wasn't working to such an extent that I would contemplate what would it be like to not be here was confronting, but it was necessary. And it was sort of that first, I suppose, death of self or of story that then led me into what came next. So I'd say that's I suppose, the intro as far as what led me into what has now been the last 7-8 years of my life in terms of my personal journey, but also my professional journey.
Yeah, I believe that's a beautiful way for us to start. And there's a few threads that I as well want to pull from. What I'd be curious to hear about is in the process of seeking to fit in, to maybe receive the validation, to receive the admiration, the status, the respect, the love, the safety, what did you disconnect from? What did you maybe neglect or even abandon in the process? Just to give as well our listeners a bit of an understanding of what that process of disconnecting and self-abandonment actually looks like.
Yeah, self-abandonment is definitely the terminology that I would use and continue to use in aspects of my life. And it's something that is kind of an ongoing piece of work for me in various realms. What that looked like for me was I stopped at some point listening to my gut, began to fall into the practice of ignoring my gut. The whispers were still there, the voice is still there, the intuition is still there, but just the prioritization became, what do I think I should be doing? Yes. Not what do I want to do or need to do for me. And I became so well practiced in that you then start to tip the scales beyond and you go, that's my way of operating now. That's my operating system, is what do I think I should be doing based on how it will be received by others and how I will be received by others and what I believe that will create. And so for me personally, I think the key areas that showed up in were, the word that just came up for me was expression. So expression through creativity, expression through emotion, expression through art. I'm not an artist in the traditional sense of drawing and painting, but certainly I see now in my work a level of art in terms of writing and creating of spaces and language. That's, for me, that's where I paint. And I lost that. The hindsight piece and the therapeutic piece is so interesting and enlightening to me now, because I look back at what were the subjects at school that I loved or that I found fulfilling, and it was the English, it was the creative, it was the expressive. And by the time I got to age 18 in my last year of school, I was studying maths, I was studying economics, I was studying the analytical and the numerical, and I go, that is just the most basic expression of the journey that I'd gone through. There's still something in me, and this isn't something I have ever really spoken about on podcasts for whatever reason, but there's still something in me. I've always had this thought in the back of my mind of, oh, I'd love to act. And I think back and I say, I enjoyed drama at school. I enjoyed that. And at what point did I just completely disconnect from that, completely block that off? And I think to something I mentioned in that first piece was this curiosity around the philosophical, around psychology, around human nature, which has come full circle in the most powerful way in terms of what I do now and the things that I enjoy and how I like to investigate my life, but also life more broadly, and the topics and the notions that I continue to find just so much vitality in. I guess that's probably the expression piece for me, both from the emotional level, but also the intellectual level as well.
I think this is a really fascinating topic. And if I were just to as well reflect back with a little bit of my own journey and maybe explore a few themes from there, it's interesting because I've heard a little bit of your journey through the research I've done. I imagine you won't know much of me, but I can very much connect to a lot of the things that you're saying in terms of your past, in terms of the evolution that you'd made, in terms of the things that you struggled with, and as well the things that you've had to disconnect from. Hence, probably as well the realm of work that we as well operate in. But I was born in Germany, moved to Canada when I was 10 with my entire family. We lived there for 7 years, which was a very impressionable experience for me. And then we eventually moved back to Germany. So there's a lot of themes around belonging. I as well reflect on the fact that particularly those teenage years, there seems to be a very big theme around this realm of how do I fit in terms of my bigger environment, right? And essentially, this is a time, as I see it, that is really about building a sense of self, building a sense of who we are in the world, and as well, how do we interact with a bigger tribe, let's just say. And if we don't actually have a solid foundation or some individuals to fall back to, where we can maybe riff off some of those insecurities, some of those experiences that we're navigating, and have reflected as well back to us who we really are, and as well be acknowledged with a sense of it's okay to be who you are, right? And to be met with a level of acceptance. I think we can unconsciously run that who do I need to be program for a very long time until as well it comes to our detriment. Some people can fucking run that one for a while.
Yeah.
Whereas some individuals, maybe more sensitive individuals, I can very much connect to that as well with myself. I felt like with 23, I was already going through a midlife crisis, man.
I think about this all the time. I'm 31 and I go, I feel like I'm coming out the other side of my midlife crisis. And I go, Christ, I hope I don't have another one. And I'm sure I will have another one. But I do think I hold a lot of gratitude for having gone through it at the point that I have people in their 50s, 60s, 70s coming to my retreats and my workshops. And something I've heard so many times is, you're so lucky that you went through this so young, or it's so amazing that you went through this so young. I go, it was painful, but I hold gratitude for the fact that actually, I do feel I got to the depths of that pain in an expedited way. And as a result, have learned so much from it and grown from it. And I think you're so right as well around this forging of sense of self, because I do feel like that window around the age of 15 for me, where my parents separated and I was going through this challenging time, I felt incredibly lost at a time where you are really forging that sense of self. And I was such a well-mannered, I was the polite kid, and it's the young form of the nice guy. I was the people-pleasing, I'll tell you what you want to hear, I'll do good in school. And I think there's something talking around the topic of masculinity, and I think this spans gender, but specifically around masculinity. And for men, we're lacking in society right now the elders and the role models and the pathways of initiation, of adolescence, of moving into adulthood. And I actually think maybe on reflection, what I have experienced is this midlife crisis. I think it's maybe only labeled that because we don't have many other models for it, but it feels actually like a coming of age piece that perhaps in indigenous cultures or more ancient cultures would have happened by virtue of the way that the system and the structures of their societies are set up. At 15, 16, 17, 18, you become a man. Actually, we are a society of quite youthful, immature, not in the judgmental sense, just in terms of maturation and evolution and growth and development. We are an immature society. We see it in politics. We see it in business. We see a lot of immaturity as to how people are operating. And I think we've lost a lot of those, particularly in Western culture. We've lost a huge amount of those structures of growing up and coming of age that are so necessary to help people build that secure, stable sense of self.
I 100% agree. And I think this is as well the root of so many challenges that are here. And coming back to maybe some of my more personal beliefs, I really believe that when we don't actually receive these initiations, there's an aspect of our psyche that will actually unconsciously look out to create these initiations. This could be the heartbreak. This could be the business failing. This could be anxiety and experiencing suicidal ideation. And essentially, it is a call and ask to really look within and really reflect on what is actually happening here. And then the question is, am I going to actually listen to that call, or am I going to just continue on that? And I think the sad thing as well is with the current culture and the current setup that we have so many ways of how we can numb ourselves, so many ways of how we can distract ourselves. So I think even now, even if you experience the pain, you have all these vices that you can lean on to distract yourself. And the more we do that, the bigger as well the pain comes. And I think that as well is what leads to so much of the suicidal ideation, but also the suicide among men. And that's something I just shortly or briefly want to touch on with you. I definitely had as well that experience where I didn't actively consider or play around with the thought of suicide, but there was this sense of, well, what's the point of all this? There was a sense of suicidal ideation that was present. I wonder, when that was present for you, how did you navigate that time? How did you come out on the other side of that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think reflecting on what you shared there as well, I think for me, I never considered taking my own life, but I did consider the notion of my own death.
Yes.
And I think actually to look at that through more of the lens of the spiritual, that's exactly what it was, but from the level of ego death and death of identity. I cannot bear being this version of me anymore. How can I kill it? How can I get rid of it? And I think, unfortunately, that without being it's not necessarily a qualified view or a trained view, but a personal view, I feel like maybe that is a lot of what is going on with the challenges with suicide in society today is people they're in such depth of pain and they cannot bear to be themselves in this form anymore. And the only route that they can see out is through literal death rather than metaphorical death. And that's really challenging because no one trains anybody or teaches anybody how to navigate that as an individual. For me, it was a matter of reaching a point where something had to give. Either I was going to give or the situation had to give and things had to change. So it was a bit of a perfect storm. I had been in a relationship that wasn't necessarily unhealthy by virtue of the relationship, but brought up so much anxiety in me that I was having, again, regular panic attacks that started to affect my functioning in terms of, I think up until that point, I'd been struggling, but I'd still been able to crush it, tick all of the boxes. I was performing at a level that most people would only hope to perform at. And yet it was only when that started to be affected in terms of my performance at work, my ability to socialize, to maintain friendships, to play sport, the things that I thought I should be doing were suddenly being affected. And I went, oh, that now feels problematic. And through that period with that relationship, I also lost a friend from school to suicide during that period of time as well. I also then lost a job, and everything just started falling away and shedding, and reached a point where, as I said, something had to give. And that took me, I think it was probably my first experience really of being desperately needing help, but having zero or little to no practice of asking for it. And it was my mum who still, to an extent, plays this role at times in my life where I'm unable to ask for the help. I know I need it, but it's actually bringing up more frustration and anger in me than it is the ability to ask for help. I'm just pissed off at the world because I need help, but I can't ask for it, and it's all just trapped inside. And it was my mum at the time actually going, I knew I needed help. I knew that the place to start at that point in time was to speak to a therapist. And my mum goes, "Have you found a therapist?" I was like, "No." "Do you want me to help you find one?" "Whatever." And so she did. And that was really the beginning. I'd spoken to a few therapists in the past. Nothing had worked. I was very, very resistant and reluctant to engage in anything like that. And that really was the first door, I suppose, into getting myself support and getting comfortable speaking about these things, getting comfortable understanding myself, being willing to understand myself. And from there, that was sort of the initial opening into everything that came from that, which was, I think, in a way, I've not even really thought about this before, but I wonder if sitting in that therapist chair, having a conversation about my own mind, reignited the lost connection I had to my interest in human nature and psychology. I go, "Oh, Christ, I'm a shit show. How fascinating." And like that deep curiosity of how have I ended up here? And starting to understand that and unpack that and unravel that, I go, wow, this is fascinating. And it just lit something back up in me, I think, that started this process of then taking myself and leading myself into the realms of somatics, of breath work, of nervous system work, of movement, yoga, meditation, holistic health really became part of my life in a way that it had never been, and that I was highly reluctant to and resistant to and just unaware of, and just became this step-by-step process of discovering practices, things that truly worked for me, and breathwork became very quickly actually the linchpin of that puzzle, and really opened me up to a completely different experience of life that shifted both how I was experiencing the world around me, but also my identity. I think back now, and these things are just a part of my life. They're just a part of who I am, both in terms of my personal practice and my professional life. And so, yeah, I think it was firstly being in a position to receive help, to then take that help, but then actually alchemize it and do something with it myself so that I could help myself. And I think the unsung hero is probably reigniting that spark of curiosity in myself to go, okay, like, how have we got here? It's 10 odd years of autopilot where I've ended up deeply miserable. And so the antidote to that at the time seemed to be deep and curious and intentional self-exploration and self-understanding and self-inquiry.
Few things come up for me when I hear you speak about these things. The first one being just this challenge around asking for help. And I see it as well in myself. And even though I've been exploring this internal work as well for pretty much a decade now, it can still be a difficulty. I actually reached out to a mentor of mine today and shared with him I would love to do a few more sessions. I'm noticing stuff coming up at the moment, and I would like to receive some support. And truthfully, I already knew the answer 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I already knew that I wanted to work with him. I already knew that I wanted to make this happen. But there was something in me that there's still maybe wrapping under this notion that as a man, I got to have it figured out on my own. I got to be competent. My value resides in my competence, right? And my capacity to do it on my own. And I'm not here to challenge that as some truth. I think there is something to say for us as men, that the potency and the value in our capacity to lead ourselves. But that doesn't negate the fact that we as well need help and to receive support as well. So I think that's a really big one that I might just want to name.
Yeah, and as you were speaking there, I think what showed up for me is something that is very present for me right now, which is this in everything. Ultimately, we see these two seemingly contradictory truths in life, and that for me, in my own experience, and I think for men more broadly, is such a challenging one, which is actually, yeah, you should have your shit together. It's important to really know what you're doing and to be able to support others and to be able to support yourself first and foremost, whilst also not holding that truth at the loss of your capacity to be vulnerable. And I think that's where the balance gets a little out of whack in one way or the other. Either we're heavily in, and I've been on both sides of this, I feel heavily in our vulnerability, and it's like, please help me, I'm a little boy, or I don't need help.
Yep.
And you shut down, and it's that shadowy side of the stoic, of just stiff upper lip, crack on regardless, and then you're drowning and nobody knows. And how do you strike that balance? How do we course correct to go, okay, where am I at here? And where do I need support? And when do I need support? And being able to ask for that in a way that is intentional, in a way that is measured, in a way that is still holding yourself, but almost the ultimate act of holding yourself in your capacity to ask for help from others.
That's it. One of my mentors speaks about this idea that wisdom is applying the right knowledge at the right time.
Yeah.
So even pondering on these two extremes that we might have that you just referred to, and the tension between those two, having the capacity essentially to hold those and then reflecting on, okay, what is really needed here based on the spectrum of all these things that I could do. Most people fall into the extreme of this or that, binary, not recognizing there's a lot of nuance in between. And then also having as well that capacity in oneself to actually hold paradox. I think there is a sense of, there's a sign for me of maturity in that. There's a sign of wisdom in that for me, in knowing that life is paradoxical. Sometimes the thing that works in one instance will not work in another instance. And we need to understand when is what required. And truthfully, that is incredibly challenging. It took me many fucking years to have somewhat of an understanding of that. And I'll fail all the time. And I know that will probably be for the rest of my life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that's helped me recently with this idea of kind of poles and spectrums and paradoxes is actually, if we take this example, trying not to think of them. I'm a very visual person. When I'm visualizing the poles and the pull. And for me, I go, if we view them as these kind of contradictory forces that are working against one another, then of course there will be tension. But actually, if you can take them off of the same spectrum and put them on their own spectrums, where it's going, this is my capacity to hold myself and to be moving forward and be decisive and in that energy and self-sufficient. And this is my capacity to be vulnerable and say when I don't have the answers and when I do need support. And it's going, they can move together, like, and in different areas. And this is the discernment piece, right? Which I think is so valuable and important, which is going, in this area of my life, I'm good. But in this area of my life, I need some support. And it's going, those don't take away from each other. And to be vulnerable in one area does not need to undermine the strength in another area.
I love the visual that you just provided, and it really opened something up for me because I did see it more as a tension. I think in some instances that there might be some truth to that.
Yeah.
But like the visual I had, it was almost a bit like train tracks and certain capacities maybe needing to be moved at the same time. And as well, like really reflecting on, okay, like maybe dialing that up just a little bit here or what's really needed here. And I just want to name, like, I'm really enjoying our capacity within this conversation to really go into the philosophical. I'm noticing that there's a depth here that I can really play with here. And I'm noticing as well my desire to return a little bit back to the intention of bringing it to breathwork, and as well looking at how our listeners might as well benefit from the understandings that we might have in this realm. And I want to bring it back to the question of what made breathwork the linchpin for you. And specifically, I'm curious to hear if you have something to say around, or if you believe that. Why do you believe breathwork could be valuable, particularly for men?
Great question. I have a unique capacity to sidewalk conversations away from the topic of specifically breath, but I'm always happy to come back. My journey with breathwork has also evolved. And so I think there's two parts. So kind of two parts of the value for me of breathwork, or the impact. And then I think we can tie it back to men. So when I first discovered breathwork and experienced breathwork, I think I did what is the natural thing, which is, this is a, whether we want to call it a biohack or a tool or a technique or whatever it might be, that will help me achieve X. It's input, outcome. And that's valuable. It helped me to no end in terms of the daily practices, micro practices of regulating my nervous system, of just slowing down the level of energy in my system as someone who was running at a really high intensity of anxiety and overwhelm. It helped just to lower that down. Then as well, the deeper experiences of conscious connected breathwork and these healing modalities of breathwork that connected me to a sense of spirituality, to my own experience of my emotions, to altered states of consciousness as a gateway into a connection to something bigger or more real than myself, meaning, purpose, just really stripping back the layers of conditioning and the mind and the ego that were blocking me from that innate essence and nature that I started losing my way from at 14, 15 years old, and really bringing me back to that and revealing and unveiling that sort of authentic nature within myself. And so that was really my route in, was the day-to-day practice of using my breath to work with my state. And that was really, really powerful. To drop in even deeper and connect to something beyond that and beyond the level of thought and perception, and the deeper sense of myself was also incredibly powerful, and really reconnecting back to my emotions in a significant way. As that has evolved, both in terms of how I teach and how I share this work, but also how I experience it myself, that serves a purpose, but I think it also limits us in terms of where we can go with the breath and what we can do with it. And for me, the way that I see the breath and the role of the breath, actually, in hindsight, how it impacted me to begin with and how it continues to impact me and the people that I work with, is through this lens of three core challenges of modern existence, if we're going to get really broad and generalize. The first being disconnection and disembodiment from self. This is the exact issue that I was facing way back when. The second being chronic dysregulation, anxiety, stress, burnout on a mass scale. Society is dysregulated, so of course we are dysregulated at a large scale. And then the third being disconnection from meaning and purpose. So this absence of traditional meaning structures, this absence of religion in a lot of ways, absence of spirituality, the rise of nihilism and fundamentalism. The people in the middle, the bulk of us, haven't got a huge amount to believe in and have faith in. And that makes for a very mind-led, intellectually led society that only breeds a level of discontent to an extent from that over-analytical place. And so three core issues for me that I'm not here to say ever that breath will solve all of your problems, because that would make me as bad as the rest of them. But I do believe breath can play a role in addressing those three, in the sense that the awareness piece, the connection piece to self, connect to your breath, you connect to self. Simple, functional breathing. How are you breathing? What does that mean? Can you learn to speak the language of your breath? Working with the breath from a nervous system perspective to work with anxiety and stress and bring down that level of activation, and then conscious connected breathing, altered states of consciousness to connect to meaning and purpose. And so I go, what are the challenges we're facing, and what tools do I have for me, but also that I understand and can share with others, that can genuinely help us navigate what we're facing, rather than putting a plaster or a band-aid over the symptom. I'm experiencing anxiety. Well, here you go. It's actually no, like, how can we address the root cause and navigate that?
This is beautiful. And I see very much these core issues being present, and as well ones that I'm constantly navigating as well with myself or with other clients I'm working with. And I would as well attest to the fact that breath can very much tend to these challenges, and it can be a vehicle through which we can find deeper sovereignty, deeper awareness, and deeper support in all these areas. So let's maybe move on and bring a little bit more awareness to, I'm going to say, the nitty-gritty around breathwork, and give our listeners a bit more of an understanding of what is it that we're actually talking about. And maybe let's begin just very general. What is breath work? And also, I would love for you to as well relate it back to the nervous system. So giving a bit of a general understanding of why breath, and how does that relate back to the nervous system? Why is that even important?
For sure. Yeah, the important stuff. Do you know Pete Holmes, the comedian?
I don't.
With Pete Holmes?
No.
Brilliant. Like I'll share it. There's a podcast he did with John Viveki. It's just amazing
John
conversation.
It's incredible.
And Pete is deeply philosophical. And the reason that's just a tangent that popped into my head, but his wife always says to him whenever he does a live show, remember, they haven't heard this before. Obviously, he's heard it 1,000 times. I've heard this stuff inside my own head 1,000 times. And so it's easy just to go all the way into the depths of it and go, yeah, you guys know what I'm thinking. And I think it's really important to remember that and go, what do I wish everybody knew?
Yes.
And never assuming a level of understanding. So with that in mind, for me, breathwork has become and is a broad brush. It's an umbrella term that covers any way we can use our breath to shift our state on the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. It's really the art and science of how we work with the breath. And that can take many different forms. But for me, I suppose to bring it back to those three core issues, there are three core layers to that build on one another and very much live together, but also live separately. The first is really around breath awareness and functional breathing. So this is going, how am I breathing right now? How do you breathe day to day, moment to moment? How do you breathe at rest, during sleep, during exercise, as you answer emails, as you're on a podcast, whatever it might be? What is that natural, habitual pattern of breathing that has evolved and developed over time? And how can you become both more aware of that, but then also work to optimize, for lack of a better word, that to support your overall health and well-being? How can we really just tune into the breath from an awareness perspective to connect to yourself, but then also work with your breathing pattern to ensure that it's helping rather than hindering? So that for me is the low-hanging fruit of what can somebody do right now? Start paying attention to everything, but to your breath. The second layer is about more directly the nervous system and breathwork for nervous system regulation, which is how can we use the breath intentionally as a tool to create a shift in our state. So the breath is unique as part of something called our autonomic nervous system, which governs all of our automatic functioning. The breath is unique because it's the only part of that system that can be both unconscious and conscious. And so it provides this veil, this window, this sort of direct line into the nervous system to create change. So through changing the breath, as most people are now, I'd say, we were talking about the echo chamber before, but I think most people now are becoming aware, if not are already aware, of the fact that if you change how you're breathing, you can influence how you feel. And what is going on there is you are shifting the state of the nervous system, either kind of at a broader level to increase activation, to actually turn the dial up, or to turn the dial down. Mm-hmm. And so that for me is really the core of breathwork as a practice, is actually this direct and intentional influence of the nervous system.
If I may just jump in here for a moment. I just want to as well add one thing, which is this recognition that the nervous system essentially is a lens through which we look at the world. And from that lens, from a very primal lens, I would say, we're looking for, am I safe or am I not safe? And so there's always going to be a detector of a perception of threat or not. And so when we're in a dysregulated state, when we're in a more, I'm going to say, aroused state or upregulated state, there is going to be a tendency towards looking at the world as threatening. And so this is kind of where I would say the things that you had addressed are just so essential and so important, that if we have that capacity to notice that and be aware of that, we can use the breath as a modulator to essentially down-regulate in those moments. Generally, that would be through focusing on the exhales or relaxation, whereas the inhale is more the upregulator, which will then support us in down-regulating our nervous system. And if someone just does that for a few minutes, they might notice that the perception through which they view life, they view other people, is going to change dramatically.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I speak to all the time, is this notion of the nervous system being the lens through which we experience the world. And it's a beautiful positioning for actually the real life application of like, what does that mean? Because I laugh at myself at this point, but also just like the industry more broadly, because we go, you need to regulate your nervous system. Regulating your nervous system is great. You should regulate your nervous system. And actually, I could understand why somebody would enter into this world going, yeah, but so what? Why should I do that? And it's exactly that. It's the lens. You are able to shift the lens through which you're viewing the world. And that is, I think, probably even in my own brain, something we massively underestimate. If you can change how you're responding to the world around you, who doesn't want that? To actually be back in the somewhat driver's seat was such a powerful part of my own journey with the breath, because the anxiety was so strong that I felt like I was not even in the passenger seat, but in a booster seat in the back of the car, just getting driven around with no influence whatsoever. And so I think that's so powerful when it comes back just to reclaiming autonomy. And then to come to the third and final piece, this is where we get into the realm of whether we want to call it transformational style breathwork, therapeutic breathwork, conscious connected breathwork, comes under many different names and guises nowadays. But what we're really speaking to is the role of the breath to be a gateway into the deeper layers of the psyche and the self and the body as well. And we're talking about altered states of consciousness, working with the subconscious mind, and really these experiences where we can use the breath in a specific way to work with our blood biochemistry, with our brain activity, to create what I view as a emerging experience, emerging of conscious and unconscious, emerging of self with source. Like, it's really this process of turning down the dial on that ego mind and connecting to those deeper layers. And through experiences like that, we can process emotions, we can work with past experiences, with subconscious and unconscious material, and we can also connect to the numinous, and which is beyond our literal grid in terms of our day-to-day waking state consciousness, which for me was actually an underestimated but really impactful part of my own journey with this work, which was that it connected me back, not even back, I would say it connected me to a sense of spirituality for the first time in my life. And we cannot underestimate that in terms of psychological health when it comes to having a belief in something beyond the 6 inches in front of our face.
Hey everyone, I just want to take this brief interruption to express my deepest gratitude for your support of this podcast. Watching it grow, reaching more listeners, and having impactful conversations with incredible guests has been truly amazing. As an avid podcast listener myself, I truly know how valuable your time and attention are, and so I don't take it for granted that you choose this show amongst so many other great options. That's why I'm committed to making these conversations insightful, informative, and supportive on your journey in men's development, emotional resilience, self-leadership, and relationships. If you've been finding value in this conversation or past ones, my ask is simple. Please support the show by subscribing so you never miss a future episode. I cannot emphasize enough that leaving a 5-star rating on Spotify or a written review on Apple makes a huge difference. It helps more people discover the content and allows me to bring on exciting new guests in the future. And if today's episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support fuels this movement and keeps it growing. Let's keep building it together. Now, back to the show.
Beautiful. I would love to as well emphasize one of those aspects that you had spoken of. And within the school of thought that I was as well trained under as well, there's this recognition of when there's certain overwhelming experiences that we have. One could even maybe argue under the conversation around trauma, if we want to bring into that anything that might be too much, too fast, too soon. If those experiences are incompleted, if we don't have that capacity to have that very upregulating experience, but reorientate ourselves back into a sense of safety, the orientation through which the nervous system is going to come from is that we're still in the experience. And so this is where I find as well conscious connected breathwork and those more therapeutic or transformational styles of breathwork are just so fundamental, just in the recognition that the anxiety that one may experience may not be from what happened today, but rather it's eliciting something that might have happened a decade ago or 15 years or 20 years ago. And so these are things that we're navigating. And so I found that particularly this modality is beautiful as well to really support and bring these aspects to the surface so they can be felt and essentially completed, so we can then reorientate ourselves back into a sense of safety. And of course, there's a lot of nuance within this conversation, and I love this map that you've created for us, and I would like to dive a little bit deeper into all of them and explore a little bit more nuance within this conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a real important role for these deeper experiences within this broader conversation, because I do feel at the moment that there is a level of this belief within the world of personal development and healing that if we just, it's a little bit like what we were saying before about the ticking the boxes of success. It's like if you tick the boxes of wellness, then you'll feel okay. And actually, a lot of people are coming up short with that. I certainly have myself. There are practices that have really supported me, but I also notice at times where it's just adding another thing and another thing and another thing and optimizing another thing. And we go, is this the point? Is this it? And what is deeper than that? What is more real than that? What is beyond that? And I do feel that altered states of consciousness and these transformational experiences can really shift the dial around this side of things. I suppose in terms of this map and this model that I like to work to, look at different lenses on this, because I will often sit here and go, wow, like what a unique time in human history that we're up against these challenges, that we're up against these forces. How unfortunate for us that we are the people facing these three core issues. And then I was reading a book by Thomas More the other day that was published in 1993, and it could have been written by me today. It was like, has this guy copied this from my Substack? The fact it was like, we're 20 plus years later, and
What's the name of the book?
Care of the Soul.
Mm-hmm.
And it's looking at this soul-led approach to healing. And a lot of the stuff that I speak to now, I actually found it on a bookshelf at a villa in Ubud when I was there for 2 days. I was like, that looks interesting. Started reading it. I was like, what? And speaking about lack of meaning in the world, disconnection from self, stress, anxiety. These are uniquely human experiences, but not necessarily uniquely ours or uniquely of now. But I do think there is a lot of focus and emphasis on these challenges now because of whatever the reason, many, many different reasons. I feel there is something around the way in which we have focused, or the access to information and technology piece, that I think is adding to this dysregulation that is really challenging for people right now, and disconnection from meaning. I think that the devices and social media and all of that side of things is creating more pressure on us to move beyond these things. And I think there's an interesting and challenging aspect to it as well, because a lot of the people that are drawn to this work of wanting to improve oneself are often showing up, not always, but very often from what I've seen and experienced myself, with some level of wound around not being enough and not being good enough and not being okay as they are. And now they find themselves in the vortex of social media and wellness telling them that if they just do this thing, then they'll be fine. And if you're not doing this thing, then that's not good. And it's feeding the same wound. And social media is the same. It's feeding the same wound that has actually led people to this work in the first place. And I really feel like we're going to see a shift in something as to how we navigate that, because I do feel that I encounter so many people, and have felt this in myself as well, this real sense of intellectually there's a deep level of understanding. There's a real depth of like, I get myself, I understand my patterns, but feeling stuck, going, what do I do with that? Where's the integration? Where's the action? What comes next? And so I'm not entirely sure I've answered the question, but I do think the map that we've spoken to is helpful, but also we need to bring that nuance in order to enable us to integrate it and put it into action and really see long-lasting change.
Yeah. I love this point that you're speaking to. First of all, because I noticed that within the question that I'd asked, it was more about exploring the technicals around these three. But I'm still very happy that you went here, because I think you're speaking to something that's incredibly important. And what I'm observing is, where am I coming from as I'm going on this journey of personal growth and self-discovery? Am I using it to reinforce that there's something wrong with me and I need to fix myself? This is something that came up very recently.
Yeah.
That I was like, where is all this coming from? Like this pursuit. And don't get me wrong, I'm genuinely curious. I'm someone who loves to explore and go wide and explore breadth.
Yeah.
And I want to understand the human condition. That's very innate to me. But then the shadow piece was, there's something wrong with me. And now my hope is that if I just do enough, I might be fixed. And there's something really beautiful that a coach that I'm very inspired by, his name is Peter Crone. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. But he speaks to the fact that particularly those individuals, they're seeking a sense of perfection, denying their inherent sense of humanity. And then what's happening? Well, we're seeking to help humans, but what we're doing is denying our own humanity in the process. And that was a really big wake-up call for myself as well, where I'm chasing a sense of perfection. I'm chasing a sense of trying to get somewhere. So all those vulnerable and tender aspects of myself that might have gotten hurt in the past, but also that sensitivity that I just inherently carry, so that won't ever get hurt again. I want to ensure that that happens. But within that, I got to put it up in a cellar and just completely dismiss it and just lead with this front of calmness and composure. And that's an aspect of me, this level of cultivation, I'm going to say. But where is the aliveness in that? Where is the humanity in that? Where's the realness in that? Where's the weirdness in that? And I think that is something that I've as well lost in myself. And that's really as well the journey right now that I'm seeking as well to reclaim within myself. And essentially, within all these patterns, I just recently came out of a training with David Data. That was really profound. And what a gift as well it was for me to experience that. And one of the things that he had addressed is, we can do therapeutic work for the rest of our lives. And regardless of how much work we do, there's always something more to discover. Eventually, there needs to come a point where we've done enough work in such a way that our past doesn't debilitate the way we show up in the present moment. And then we got to find humor with these things. We got to find acceptance with these things. And then let's make art out of it.
Yeah.
That's his language, right? Let's make art out of it, and recognizing, okay, like maybe I have a bit of a crippled arm with these wounds that I have, but that's maybe as well part of my gift. Let's make art out of it.
Oh yeah, 100%. And it's something, again, that this book, Care of the Soul, spoke to, which is this: we're emphasizing change so strongly that we're denying ourselves our innate human nature. And I do think the broad industry that we operate in is responsible for that to an extent, or it's certainly an expression of that. The large majority, I'd like to think, of people in this space are well-intentioned, but I also think there is a necessary wake-up call to bring this conversation into all of the work that's being done, which is going, and maybe in a roundabout way, unintentionally, in your question that I somewhat misinterpreted around the nuance of these layers of breath, I actually think the answer that I gave is the preface to that, which is to go, nice. I could tell you everything, and we can speak about every last piece of the nitty-gritty of the science of these practices and how to implement them and what works, but only with the important caveat that you also just need to accept yourself as you are and meet yourself where you are and be okay with that.
Listeners, please don't use this to fix yourself.
Yeah, exactly that. Exactly that. It's that fine line, and I think language just doesn't do it justice at points, which is, there's a difference between something that supports you and something that's striving to fix you. And you go, is this serving me in order to live my life? Or is this a pursuit of trying to fix myself so then I can live?
Or validate my ego identity.
That too, which is a whole different ball game entirely, a different kettle of fish. But yeah, I think it's a really important part of the conversation. And I think the reason it comes up for me right now, and I find it fascinating to actually reflect on the intention of your original question versus what ended up transpiring, because it didn't cross my mind once to go into the specifics of things, because I think it's been so present for me over the last couple of years to work through this in how I work on myself, but also how I work with others in terms of bringing that level of nuance and like understanding to what we're doing and how we're doing it, and really helping people understand that there has to come a point where acceptance is the number one priority. And it's from that place that we go, oh God, isn't that a weight off, when it's just like, I understand how I've got here and I understand where I want to go and I have my toolkit that supports me. And now let's live. And I think we've gotten into this bubble in certain areas where it's about healing for the sake of healing, whether that's for validation or whether that's a pursuit of this perfect, unattainable form. I think it's really, really important.
Nuance is important. It speaks to me, at least, a level of intelligence, a level of maturity, a level of care as well. Just in the recognition that we could be on this podcast making bold claims about the power of breathwork. And don't get me wrong, like, it is fucking powerful. It's changed my life.
Yeah.
Like, it really has. But nonetheless, we also have to consider the nuance, like how many individuals are using the language of do this thing because it's so powerful and it will change your life and all these things to actually sell a program.
Yeah. To say it'll cure this or it'll cure that. Exactly to your point. And again, it's this tension that we spoke to of the contradicting poles, which is, yeah, it's absolutely changed my life. I was having near daily panic attacks and I haven't had a panic attack in over 6 years. Of course, that's huge. And through something that is so accessible, and the boldest of marketing claims within this space, I believe, is rooted in reality, it's rooted in truth. But when it's too polished, when it's too clean, when it's too definitive, when it's overhyped, it begins to lose its integrity. It begins to lose, this will cure your X, and it's speaking to everybody. And actually it's going, this is how it works. This is why it works. And it might work for you. And how amazing is that? Why don't you see? And even if it doesn't, you'll be okay. And that, much less sexy, much less sellable, but God, it feels so much better. And I think that is a really important part of this work, because the impact of it is undeniable. And that's why we've seen the increase in understanding and education and application of this stuff. But the nuance, the ego, nuance goes missing very quickly in the hands of the ego when the ego is left to run riot.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. First of all, I'm really happy that we went down this rabbit hole, because it was very unexpected of me. And nonetheless, I really hope as well listeners really receive a lot of value from this. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And nonetheless, I think it could still be valuable
100%.
For some listeners who at least not know so much about breath yet,
Yeah.
to get a bit of a general understanding of it. And then I noticed as well that within these 3 themes, there's definitely some layers as well that I want to explore in terms of the nuance. So maybe you can explore a little bit around functional breathing, just to give a bit of an understanding of how would we actually want to breathe, and how can we start to move that dial a little bit in terms of improving the way we breathe day to day.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think these are the real fundamentals, right? And I think it, as with all things, as with all change, it begins with very simple but important awareness. So actually through the day, and this is just an ongoing exercise, connecting to your capacity to check in with your breath, not to change it necessarily, but simply as a barometer of where you're at, and actually going, even before we get to understanding it, you go, just observing it. I am waiting for a bus. I am about to give a speech. I am about to have an uncomfortable conversation, or those are all more challenging, I suppose, but also I'm about to do something really great. I'm about to do something I really enjoy. How am I breathing? And to come back to this nervous system kind of as a lens through which we experience the world, the breath is also a barometer of your energetic state. If you are breathing openly, expansively, deeply, slowly, you're at ease in the world. If you're constricted and contracted and your breath is short and shallow, you're not. And again, it's this mirror of your energy state. So that first piece around observation and awareness is really just connecting to, we take the average adult 20 to 30,000 breaths every single day. So just starting to pay attention, not to every single one, but to some of them. And then we start to learn, okay, interesting, what is going on here? For a lot of people, we do see this chronic or acute dysfunctional breathing, typically around breathing very fast, very shallow into the chest and or through the mouth. That is, if people have started to observe their breath, typically how we breathe when we are stressed, anxious, when we're in that activated response. And so if we're breathing like that at rest, if we're breathing like that the majority of the time, day to day, then we are putting stress and strain on the nervous system. We're perpetuating this cycle of activation in the nervous system and dysfunctional breathing, and then really just perpetuating this. In that cycle, the easiest thing to influence and change is the breath. And so that's where we go, okay, I might have noticed that is how I breathe day to day. How do I want to breathe? What are the fundamentals? So we want to be breathing through the nose. We want to be breathing gently and softly, expansively and deeply into not just the belly, but the lower belly, side ribs, lower back, getting full 360 expansion led by the diaphragm. And we want to be breathing slowly. And so that for me is the first port of call as we go, okay, if nothing else, step one, notice how you're breathing in any given situation. Step two, if you're not breathing through the nose, breathing slowly, gently, and deeply, begin to breathe like that. Doesn't need to be any more complicated than that, just to lay the foundations of how should your body be breathing, ideally, when you are at rest. And it's just like that. And the puzzle pieces that make up that, I guess, formula are really from two core perspectives. The first being the nervous system. So the slower we breathe, the deeper we breathe, the more calm and relaxed and regulated the nervous system becomes. And also from a biochemical standpoint, in terms of balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your system, when we breathe more slowly and more gently, we get this enhanced balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide for better brain oxygenation, better cognitive function, but also performance in the body as well.
Beautiful. It speaks as well to the first point that you made, which was disconnection of self, and the simple act of bringing awareness to ourselves and noticing what's going on within ourselves. That already can be incredibly profound.
100%. And to circle back to your question about for men as well, and power of breathwork for men, that was probably my first hook into breathwork. Was I felt my body. I felt sensations in my body. I felt change in my body, probably for the first time that I could remember, really obviously, just being like, oh, I have a body. I'm not just here. I'm not just thoughts. There is a physical realm here. And the breath connected me to that very quickly and strongly. And I think for men in particular, but I think it's an epidemic on a broader scale, which is just disembodiment. Disconnection in the sense that we don't understand ourselves, sure, but also disembodiment, that we're just not feeling. We are feeling beings as much as we are thinking beings, if not more than we are thinking beings. And so I think this first window is simple, quote unquote, but so rich and has so much substance to it.
Yeah, and what I notice, at least from my experience, there's some individuals who might, from their constitution, be a little bit more robust, that they can somewhat handle that and tend to that. And some individuals are going to be a little bit more analytical. I would argue for those sensitive individuals, they essentially need that sense of connection to themselves, because it is their thermometer to really track where they are with themselves. Like, I need that sense of connection to myself, because it gives me a depth of understanding of where I'm at, and based on where I'm at, what I'm needing. So if I'm in a stressful situation, or if I've an important conversation coming up or something like that, I've noticed that I can be somewhat upregulated within my nervous system. So to have that capacity to notice, oh, this is what's going on right now, and then use the tools that I have to downregulate myself, that's profound.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a super important point. I also think as well, in the interest of nuance, just the recognition and acknowledgement of all of us being different. And even within that, any nervous system practitioner kind of worth their salt will know that, or be able to appreciate and acknowledge that bringing somebody straight into their body is not necessarily safe for everybody. Sometimes just dropping into the body can be overwhelming. You know, you go, oh my God, I'm feeling so much.
Right.
I'm feeling so much anxiety. You know, there's a reason we've disconnected.
Yes.
And so just to go get in your body, it doesn't bring the level of nuance and sensitivity to the topic that it needs as well. So it's going, okay, how do we actually help somebody come back to themselves in a way that is manageable for them and tolerable for them?
I love that distinction. And as well, it really speaks as well to the importance of receiving support from qualified individuals within this space when that's really required.
Yeah.
Because let's say we do some research on our own on this stuff, and then start to bring our awareness to it, and then what we find is really overwhelming, and then all of a sudden we can't capacitate what we're discovering about ourselves. There is something to say about receiving support.
Absolutely. I think education and understanding is fantastic, but also getting the right support in terms of somebody who understands the nuance of this, the application of this, and that there is no one size fits all approach to this as well. And this is where kind of being a generalist specialist comes into this, where it's going, I'm not just a practitioner of X, because that is limiting. I understand this at a very broad and deep level, so that if somebody, I go, focus on your breath, and they get incredibly anxious by just focusing on their breath, how do we navigate that? What do we do now? And how do we meet somebody where they are, rather than trying to mold them into a box that is of our making?
So I think this could be a beautiful time for us to segue over to the second pillar that you described, which was a lot around emotional regulation and nervous system regulation.
Yeah.
Could you expand on those ideas that you have around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we live in a now very well documented time of anxiety and overstimulation. I think the world, we were talking about how Bali has evolved and changed over the last few years, and the stimulation that we find ourselves faced with on a regular basis, whether that's through our devices, through just the world around us, and the pace at which things are moving. I think pace is a big conduit for the stimulation that we're all feeling. This kind of hyper convenience culture has facilitated not more ease and peace, it's actually facilitated more pace and more strain. And so we are hungry, we are thirsting for tools to balance the scales around that. And it comes back to what we spoke to earlier around the breath and its unique role within the nervous system to create change and create a shift in our state. The most accessible understanding of the autonomic nervous system is this two-branch model of sympathetic, which is our fight-flight response, our stress response, and parasympathetic being the rest and digest. And I think it's sufficient for the majority of us to just go, okay, that as an understanding helps, and it works because you have two levers. You have an accelerator pedal to increase activation, and you have a brake pedal to decrease activation. Do I need to turn up the dial, or do I need to turn down the dial? And a lot of what we see today does require, typically, if we were going to give a broad brush stroke, that down regulation piece, that calming piece. how we would do that through the breath, I want to come back to, because I feel it's important in these conversations to go a little bit deeper and to explore some other ideas around this. And a lot of people now will be familiar with polyvagal theory, which is this slightly evolved theory of understanding around the nervous system in this realm, and looking at these three branches of nervous system state. The first being this ventral vagal response, which is calm, connected, social engagement. We have the sympathetic response, which is that activation and mobilization response. And then we have the dorsal vagal response, which is our shutdown, immobilization. So we're sort of good, connected, we are riled up and activated, or we are shut down. So centered, mobilized, immobilized, to sort of simplify. The reason I think this is really important in the conversation around breathwork is because the industry, my wonderful industry, I think, and I've been guilty of this myself in the past, is very, very good at saying slow breathing will cure all of your problems. If you are stressed, slow breathing. If you are anxious, slow breathing. If you are withdrawn, slow breathing. If you're dysregulated, slow your breath down. Helpful the majority of the time, but I think limited and not accurate. And I'm a sucker for accuracy. And so why I think the polyvagal model really helps is that we go, okay, we've got this central window of tolerance and capacity to hold life, which is that ventral vagal state. There will be times where we go up into mobilization, and there may be times where we fall down into the immobilization. The distinction is key in terms of dysregulation, because the tools through which we would re-regulate or move ourselves out of those states are different. Very kind of simply, if we are in this high energy, high arousal state, we want tools that are going to bring down the amount of activity in our system. If we are in immobilization, we actually want something that might gently bring some energy into the system. Slow breathing will not do that. And so if somebody is in this shutdown stuckness, then just relentlessly telling them to slow things down may not do harm. It may just not help. It might just keep somebody at this low lethargy kind of depressive state if they are in that more shut down state.
I love the distinction that you're providing. And of course, it brings for me as well the question of, well, how does an individual notice, am I in a mobilized state or am I in an immobilized state? I guess what I'd point out on that, the nervous system response that I was more habituated in was definitely freeze, more immobilization. So there was a settlement of numbness and disconnection that settled in for me. So I can very much attest as well to what you're saying. And for me, there was a level of mobilization that was required. And there's so many different ways of exploring this. Like one of my teachers, Carlos Sanchez, is incredible in bringing subtle movement in, especially for those individuals who are somewhat immobilized, just to activate the body again. And this is something as well that we're seeing in conscious connected breathwork circles, that there might be certain reflexes that come up. And then if we can point that out, and if we see, let's say the left hand wants to move, maybe just encouraging the individual just to gently orientate the movement back into that hand, just to awaken into the body. And what I've observed is that often there's a natural emergence of particular emotions, or maybe even a bigger experience that's underneath that's actually asking to be expressed. And when that is expressed, that's actually when we can orientate back into a sense of safety and as well mobilization.
Exactly that. Exactly. And I think it's such an important piece of the puzzle, because, and I see it a lot in the UK, but also sort of more broadly Western world, which is where the first pillar of disconnection and disembodiment meets the second pillar. And you've got people who they've been told that they're going to be lying down and doing some breath work, and they decide that means that they have to stay rigid, and any sense of they're almost repressing without realizing, or maybe it is conscious, the movement that could be there as their system maybe wants to bring that in or wants to mobilize. And so I do think there's a real key part of this, which is encouraging movement gently, safely, in a way that is manageable and tolerable to somebody coming out of that state. But to your point as well, how do we how do we identify? How do we figure that out? And again, this is by no means an exact science. Quote that I always come back to on this, and that friend James Dowler first shared with me was, the map is not the territory. And so, of course, we can have this wonderful map, but living it is very, very different. And so beginning again to observe, and I get a lot of my groups to do this practice of just going, not even necessarily right now, but think back to a time where you experienced high stress. Where did you go? Are you confrontational? Do you want to run away? Do you shut down? Like, where do you go? We all know whether we have note of it or not. We all know where we go in those moments. And once you can start to identify that, that's where we go, okay, what can I do differently? Or what can I do about that? If I can catch it earlier, can I manage that? Can I allow myself to feel it without repressing it or without letting it take over? And yeah, what are my tools to help me navigate these situations based on the map that I have of myself? What is my unique map, and what is my unique set of tools to create change? And I think that's super, super powerful. And from a breath perspective, if we are bringing down the charge in the system, it is the slow breathing. It is focusing on the exhale. It is the foundations of functional breathing that we spoke to, of just, can you breathe gently, slowly through the nose into the belly and extending the exhale? It's just a fail-safe more often than not for any sense of heightened energy and arousal in the system. If we're in that more shut down, low arousal state, we might be focusing more on the inhale. We might be taking slightly bigger, more active breaths. We might be bringing in some gentle movement. For me, conscious connected breathwork has been one of the most powerful tools, both personally but also in my practice, for people who do find themselves in that stuckness, because it seems to be a great way to gently introduce charge and mobilization to the system, and also seemingly clear and work with a lot of the charge that may have held us there as well. I've seen some really interesting data as well of almost this like slingshot effect of heart rate variability as this measure of nervous system regulation, where people have had either a retreat experience or a deep experience with conscious connected breathwork, and seemingly overnight their HRV has gone from low, which should be a sign of dysregulation, to almost double.
Wow.
And that, to me, I can only really explain by almost this thawing process of this, maybe it's knotted and it's just gone and we're suddenly open again. And so, yeah, I think there's just an important level of understanding as to your individual map, your unique constitution, and then how you navigate that with the tools that we have at our disposal.
Yeah. One of the things that I feel somewhat compelled to explore here with you, because I believe it is an important conversation, is I see that many individuals who are introduced to breathwork, the gateway in many ways is going to be something like Wim Hof, or maybe more upper-regulating practices. And to your point as well, when you answer the question, what is breathwork? We recognize it's an umbrella term for various different practices or explorations that we can have. Similarly to yoga, there's not one style to yoga. There's so many. And that's the same thing as well with breathwork, right?
Yeah.
And so when people are introduced to breathwork, they're like, oh yeah, I've done breathwork before. I've done this Wim Hof thing, right? Assuming that this is every style of breathwork. And then I think where it can be somewhat damaging, and I just want to make clear as well, I think it's wonderful that this modality through Wim got really public, because I believe it gave a lot of individuals access to the understanding of the power of breathwork. But I wonder if you have a few thoughts to share, especially on those individuals who might be already very dysregulated, and what approach might actually be required, and what that would as well do if they were to do something more up-regulating compared to something more down-regulating.
Yeah, I share your caveat on Wim, or your disclaimer, because I think it's no doubt has he and his organization done amazing work for the field in raising awareness and introducing people into this work. And I know as well that they have helped enormous numbers of people. So I don't want to take away from that as we kind of explore some of the nuance around this stuff as well. Yeah. And I think that's important, because it's just too easy to slate people with no kind of context. What I started hearing from people coming through my practice was, I'm doing this breath work and it's making me feel more anxious. I thought this was going to make me feel less anxious, and it's making me feel more anxious. What's going on? And I think there's another layer to explore to this as well. But for that first piece, because breathwork has grown and become more popular and more acknowledged in broadly mainstream society, we have seen lots of people finding it in lots of different ways. And very often what is associated with breathwork is you'll feel more calm. Do some breath work, you'll feel less anxious. And so people go, okay, that sounds good. I'll go and find some breath work. And because I don't think en masse the industry pays enough attention to the educational piece, and sort of the management of expectations piece is actually helping people understand why they're doing it and what they're getting themselves in for, people can find themselves just in the wrong place, doing maybe not quite the right thing for what they need, through nobody's explicit fault, but just a bit of like the hype cycle and people going, let's do some breath work, let's get high on our own supply, which is a phrase I fucking hate, and end up feeling worse. And then that damages the individual, it damages their perception of the practice. They could have maybe gotten loads from breathwork and actually have ended up going, breathwork sucks, I'm never doing that again. And that makes me sad, because I go, I believe this can probably help most people in some way, shape or form if we get it right and meet them where they're at. So if we are meeting an upregulated, activated system, somebody who's chronically stressed and anxious, and adding more fuel to that fire, if we're operating in this high arousal state and going, let's upregulate that, you're going to get someone quite often feeling worse off. They're going to feel more jittery. I do also know that I've met people who have struggled with anxiety who have actually seen a lot of good come from working with those practices. And I wouldn't feel confident necessarily enough to say exactly why, other than humans are weird and some stuff works for some people and doesn't work for others. But from what we know of the nervous system, and I guess it speaks to the breath working, yes, on the nervous system, but in lots of different ways, kind of biochemically working in the brain and the nervous system. It's there's a lot going on. So we can experience lots of different outcomes, but from what we understand of the nervous system at a fundamental level, adding activation to a highly stimulated nervous system is not a good idea. The other piece on this is that why I personally feel that quite a lot of people are drawn to that kind of practice when they are stressed and anxious is because their systems have become addicted and accustomed to high stress. And actually the stillness and the slowness is better for them, but it's more uncomfortable because we're just junkies for stress. And so to then engage in an ice bath and some fast breathing feels awfully familiar to a highly dysregulated nervous system, to an extent where we just keep going and going and going until something gives. And maybe it never will, but you're certainly not going to feel better. You'll just stay as you are.
I love this. And I actually wrote down a quote of yours that I think could be really valuable as well to share here, which is, rest will always feel like a risk to a nervous system that's used to chaos and a mind that believes its value is defined by what it achieves.
Yeah, one of my favorites. Thank you. Yeah, so two sides to this. So rest feeling like a risk to a nervous system that's used to chaos, in that we get accustomed to the chaos. We learn to go, well, this is the new normal, is this high level of intensity, and anything that departs from that is uncomfortable to face. So the nervous system can get really stuck in this place of high intensity, and the rest piece, as you slow back down, as you allow yourself to settle and do nothing and really just let yourself be, all of a sudden all of the stuff comes up and it becomes very hard to hold. So we default back to the familiar hell rather than the unfamiliar heaven. The second piece around, I suppose, the role of the mind in that is that I personally don't think any of this stuff is as straightforward as saying, if you are someone who is highly stressed and highly activated, if you do your breathwork practice, that will make it all go away. It'll help. It'll absolutely help. It will do a lot of good for most people, and I strongly believe that. But if you are still operating from this place of feeling like we've talked about as well, I need to prove myself, I need to work hard, I need to be of value, I need to do this, because you're trying to prove it to somebody, whether it's yourself or other people, you're going to fall back into patterns of overwork and overwhelm. And so we have to marry up this top down, psychological, intellectual first piece of patterns and parts and, why am I choosing what I'm choosing, with bottom up, somatic, what is going on in my body and my nervous system, and how can I help with that, with the third layer of environment design. Where am I placing myself? For me, why am I in London? I know what London does to me in terms of how I work, because we entrain to the nervous system of the environment. And there's a lot of good to that. It's achievement oriented, it's success oriented. There's a lot of opportunity, which I'm grateful for and appreciate. But I know that it's not going to be the best place for me to feel at ease. It's not going to be the best place for me to feel at peace. So what am I choosing? And the environment piece is also important when we think about things like hustle culture and our working cultures. And I think this sort of self-centered, in a way, or self-centric version of personal development devalues actually the environment piece. We think we can outmuscle a dysregulating environment. We go, I am doing my breath work and I understand the parts of me that push me towards overwork, and so that's fine and I'll be fine. But actually, it's okay to accept that you are also highly influenced by your environment, the people that you're around, the place that you are. And so I see the contrast of having spent, the month here. I found it quite hard to get into a rhythm with work because everything's a lot slower and everything's a lot more fluid. And I've needed that as a bit of a kind of balancing act and a tipping of the scales. But again, it's environment cueing behavior, and we feed off of that. And so I think, to that quote, just really tuning into, where does my environment take me? Where does my nervous system take me? What's it familiar with? Because it will fall into familiar with if we allow ourselves to autopilot. And what are the belief systems in me as well that could be keeping me in a certain pattern?
In terms of the environment thing, this is the foundational piece as well that had supported me 9 years ago when I was 23. I ended up leaving Germany because it was within the environment that I was in that I was reinforcing who I believed myself to be, and others reflected back to me, yes, Alex, you're that guy.
Yeah.
And so that somewhat kept me very stuck. I'm not saying you need to leave the place that you're at, but can you curate? Can you design your environment? Can you maintain certain boundaries as well? Ensure that the things that you really want to bring in, that you curate an environment where that can be possible, and then somewhat refrain or limit the things that you might not want. Not from a place of protecting yourself and barricading yourself from the world, because I think that can also be another shadow. But nonetheless, just by designing your life with a recognition of the type of life that you really want to lead.
Yeah. It's really, I think for me, it comes back to this idea of setting the conditions for life to flow in your favor. That's it. And that's where the therapeutic work is incredibly valuable, because you can go, oh, I suddenly realize what has led me to feeling this way. And I can also see this, for me, one of the most simple practices that's had a huge impact on this is, if I get to the end of a day and it's been a fucking awesome day, I will go back and go, what have I done today? Why? And then actually going forward, can I reverse engineer that on a day where maybe I don't feel so good? I go, what were the things on that day that made me feel really good? And I think that sort of intentionality without obsession, and going, okay, I know myself and I have my tools and I've built this environment. This is on purpose, and therefore I can now take my hands off and not oversteer and over control, and allow it to flow a little bit, because I do think it's a tricky balance again between micromanagement of every aspect of your life versus setting the conditions and the guardrails to allow things to flow in the way that you would like them to.
Beautiful. Time's running short within the structure that we have. I've absolutely loved this conversation. I would still like to close off with a therapeutic piece. So maybe just to put a window of roughly 5 minutes to it, I'd be curious, first of all, what would you want our listeners to know about this modality? And if I can as well include one thing that I would as well be curious to hear about from you. I noticed that within particularly this realm of the therapeutic modality, there's a lot of as well different styles, right? We got the soma breathwork, we got the psychedelic breathwork, we got holotropic breathwork. And I think there has been this illusion that's been created around this idea of if I just have a big experience, if I just have a big release, if I just have this cathartic moment, this is going to contribute to my healing. And it can. I don't want to negate that. But nonetheless, I am concerned about those individuals who are constantly seeking those highs in the absence of integration. So I know I've maybe led you on a little bit around that, but I wonder if you can say a few things on that and maybe anything else that you might want to say to this modality.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on as far as my own personal perspective on this. I suppose what I would want people to know about this work in particular, I think first is the reality of the impact, because I think I'm quite quick to go into the realism of like, let's just be, but actually it's mind-bendingly magical as a practice. It's great. Like,
so good.
I still look back and go, am I the only person seeing this? Like, and of course I'm not, but when I see in my spaces, when I look at the research, when I have these conversations, I'm like, God, yeah, this is potent stuff. Why are people not paying enough attention to this? And it's growing and it's wonderful. And so I think in terms of what I would want people to know is, first and foremost, the research that is emerging now is incredibly compelling, and there's more and more coming to the forefront and to the surface. But the one that I like to speak to, because it is a little bit clickbaity in the sense that it makes people stop and listen, and it gets people beyond it's just breathing. How powerful could it possibly be? And so it was a study that came out about 18 months ago that was using a similar mystical experience questionnaire to a lot of the psychedelic studies and the stuff with psilocybin. And they found that conscious connected breathwork in the form that it was delivered for the study could create mystical experiences on par with medium to high doses of psilocybin, which made me stop and listen, because I would have said, if I had to take a punt, it would maybe come out at low to medium doses of psilocybin, but this was saying medium to high doses. And that's how you get people's attention. And that's the role for me of research. The research does not need to happen to justify or validate the empirical and anecdotal impact of this work, the inherent spirituality of it that simply cannot be explained by science. However, if we want people to listen, if we want people to pay attention, that sort of thing is incredibly compelling to go, we can create a psychedelic or altered state of consciousness similar to medium to high doses of magic mushrooms. And even the most ardent skeptic goes, okay, I'm listening. Beyond that, what I think it's important for people to know is exactly as you spoke to, is that this isn't a substitute for doing the work, as with any experience of altered states of consciousness. This is about, for me, what I always like to think of as an experience of the profound to help us deeply appreciate the mundane. We go off into this big, expansive experience that can be very cathartic, that can be very powerful, that can be very psychedelic. But the goal, or the intention at least, of that is so that we can return to a higher plateau in our day-to-day lives. How do we take the insight gleaned in those moments? For me, I had a particular experience where, as someone who had experienced low mood and a form of depression for a number of years, I connected to a feeling of spirituality, but within that deep joy that I had forgotten existed. And for me, that then, when I came back down from that experience, it was a candle in the darkness of navigating my day-to-day experience, because I was like, cool, I know that exists now. So it opened my emotional capacity to that. And so with that in mind, I think from a practical level, it's really important that we go into this work safely, responsibly, in the hands of people who know what they're doing, so that it can be as powerful as it possibly can be for somebody. And that power, and I think this is important in the language that we use, that power doesn't mean explosive and expansive necessarily. I've had really big, emotive, cathartic experiences that have been valuable. I've also had subtle, from the outside looking in, gentle, still, serene experiences that have been more powerful. And so I think putting your expectation to one side, letting go of any of the bullshit that you've seen on social media in terms of what it should look like and the shiny marketing videos, and looking at this as a tool for self-exploration, for self-connection, for self-discovery, to meet yourself in a way that you simply cannot in your day-to-day waking state consciousness, and then alchemize that and do something with it. And if you don't do that, you'll have had a nice time for an hour, or you have had a challenging time for an hour and a half. And that's okay. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not going to change anything. And so if we want to use this as a catalyst for change, then we need intention, we need integration, we need proper training, ethics, and facilitation, and we need appreciation for the practice for what it is, and to really allow ourselves to explore it at depth and then bring things back from it.
Beautiful. So much I could say to that, and important aspects you had communicated. And just to maybe close it off on this conversation before asking my final question, it's just brought my love back for this practice and how much gratitude I have for it, and gratitude for Edward and, Breathwork Bali and all the mentors that had come with that, and all the individuals that I can be connected with as a result of that, such as yourself, and how it's just deeply changed my life, just in terms of creating emotional range for me, integrating certain aspects of myself that I didn't know were aspects of myself, finding more connection with myself, and as a result, deeper connection to the whole, deepening my relationships, right? Due to the deepening of the relationship to self. There's so much I could add and say to that, but I would leave it here. And yeah, maybe you just want to close it off, first of all, by thanking you for coming on this podcast. This has been such an enjoyable one, arguably one of my favorites, with such a deep dive into this beautiful realm that we're both so passionate about. Before asking my final question, where can our listeners find you? Is there anything that you want our listeners to know about?
Yeah, so people can find my work mostly through social media. I think is probably the easiest, at Jamie Clements _. My website is thebreathspace.co.uk. I would say to people, if you can, then come and find me in person, some kind of experience in person. But there's lots of ways to engage with this online and through my app, through different platforms as well.
Beautiful. So to close it off, and I think this could be a beautiful way to tie the bow on it, in terms of this therapeutic, more transformational style of breathing, a lot of it is around bringing our deeper understanding to meeting and something bigger than ourselves. And I'd be curious to hear in a minute or two, why do you believe this is important, and why do you believe this might be important for men?
So firstly, I want to give a nod to Dr. Lisa Miller, who wrote a beautiful book called The Awakened Brain. And her research essentially looks at the role of spirituality in psychological health, and found pretty undeniable proof that having a connection to spirituality has a positive, a significant, statistically significant positive impact on well-being. And so we're seeing the impact of being connected to something bigger than ourselves on just how we feel. And it for me, it's easy to be a cynical realist. It's much harder to be kind of an optimistic realist, I suppose, and somebody who has that level of faith and acceptance of something beyond myself that I don't need to understand. Maybe I'd like to understand, but I never will, and that's okay. Why that's important for men in terms of meaning and purpose is that for me, it's about having both a North Star in terms of something to aim towards. But then also, for me, meaning is the glue that binds your life together. It's how we find significance and coherence between the things in our lives that matter. It's how we can be of service and how we can allow others to be of service to us. It's what connects us to ourselves and other people. And so for me, altered states of consciousness are one of the most powerful and direct ways to connect to that, because we are just taken away from our literal intellectual understanding of the world and ourselves. And in that, it becomes quite hard to ignore and deny that there is something beyond the meat suit. And so I think for men in particular, just having this acceptance and this reverence for the universe and the world and other people, for me, it's led me down a path now, sort of non-dual philosophy, in this sense of the infinite self, and through that a connection to the fact that we're all connected, we're all one and the same, both in terms of you and I, but all of it. And that is equal parts confronting and liberating. And I think that for me is one of the great mysteries that we don't need to understand, but that I feel very connected to. And it keeps me moving forward in a time where at times it can feel quite hard to keep moving forward.
Beautiful way to close this conversation down as well, give our listeners something to chew on. And